What happens when someone flees war, searching for safety, only to face unimaginable violence right here at home? It really forces us to ask some tough questions, doesn't it, about who we're protecting, how our justice system actually functions, and why sometimes, while the very systems meant to keep us safe seem to fail so catastrophically. We're talking about the utterly heartbreaking murder of Iryna Zarutska. It was August 22nd, 2025, in Charlotte, North Carolina. She was just 23, a Ukrainian refugee who'd come to the U.S. seeking safety from war. Safety. And she was brutally stabbed to death at a light rail station. It's just devastating on its own. But then you look at the accused. Decarlos Brown Jr. is 34, an ex-convict, and his record, well, our sources detail it's deeply alarming. No less than 14 prior cases in Mecklenburg County alone of violent criminal past serious charges, plus a diagnosed condition, schizophrenia. And here's the part that just, it hits you in the gut. He had a pending court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, an evaluation that was just never carried out. Now, this incident, as outlets like Fox News reported, it didn't just make headlines. It sparked discourse over a national epidemic of soft-on-crime policies. And it really intensified these profound questions about why dangerous criminals seem to continue to roam free in our communities.
Absolutely. This tragic event, as just awful as it is, it really brings into sharp, unavoidable focus these complex threads, doesn't it? You've got immigration status, critical mental health support, and the fundamental effectiveness, or maybe the lack of effectiveness, of our criminal justice policies. So today, we're diving deep into your sources to sort of pull apart these threads. We want to understand the real data, dissect the public perceptions that are out there, and analyze these urgent policy discussions that are unfolding right now because of this.
Exactly. Our mission today is to try and cut through some of that noise to give you a clear, evidence-based understanding of these really critical issues. We're going to untangle this intersection, look at the actual crime rates, pinpoint the systemic failures, and try to understand how public perception, well, far too often, clashes so dramatically with the facts on the ground. Let's try and make sense of this together. Okay, let's start by going back to Iryna Zarutska's case, because it really acts like a harsh spotlight, doesn't it? It reveals these severe issues within our system, especially when you look at Decarlos Brown Jr.'s history. The sources, they paint a really stark picture. Brown wasn't, a first-time offender, not even close. He had this extensive criminal record, 14 prior cases just in Mecklenburg County, multiple arrests for serious violent crimes. Robbery with a dangerous weapon, breaking and entering, larceny, assault, the list goes on. Yet, despite this long, clear history of violence and his diagnosed schizophrenia, he somehow remained free to commit this terrible act. And just to underline the systemic breakdown here, that court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, it was never carried out. So it forces us to ask how. How does someone with such a documented pattern of violence, a known mental illness, and a critical court order for assessment, how do they just remain free to inflict such tragedy? How do these individuals keep slipping through the cracks?
Well, what's profoundly unsettling, according to our sources, is that this might not just be an isolated oversight. This specific case is explicitly described in the material as a systemic failure to adequately manage dangerous individuals. That's a direct quote. And the outrage from commentators and the sources, it's palpable. You can feel it. Many are calling for direct accountability for prosecutors and judges, the ones who make the decisions to release career criminals who then tragically go on to commit more violence. There's no doubt this murder fueled a powerful discourse about what many are now calling a national epidemic of soft-on-crime policies. Policies, they argue, are putting communities at risk. And if we dig a bit deeper into Brown's history, the sources highlight something really chilling. A Reddit user whose comment was actually cited in the source material noted that Brown apparently tried to get himself admitted or even arrested shortly beforehand, but was denied. Now, if that's true, it points to a critical perceived failure not just in the justice system, but maybe also in our mental health care system's accessibility and responsiveness. Our sources suggest that facilities are often severely under-resourced, or they're operating at full capacity. It leaves dangerous gaps. Plus, individuals might not always meet the really strict legal criteria for involuntary commitment, even when they seem to present clear risks. It creates this devastating kind of loophole where someone like Brown could fall through the cracks of both the justice and the health systems, and that court order for a psych-eval. Sources indicate these orders often face huge delays, overloaded forensic units, administrative backlogs. It effectively just nullifies their protective purpose. His record really underscores this pattern. Brown served 6 years for previous felonies, got released in 2020, then arrested again in 2022 for assaulting a woman, and again in January 2025 for misusing 9/11, all before the horrific murder of Iryna Zarutska in August 2025. It looks like a pattern of missed opportunities to intervene.
And the effects of Iryna's tragedy, they weren't just contained within the courtroom or the mental health system, were they? They immediately touched public safety itself. Charlotte City Council members, understandably deeply concerned about violence on the city's transit system, have publicly demanded immediate steps, concrete actions to enhance rider safety. So this tragedy, it really exposed vulnerabilities across multiple public systems, didn't it? From the courthouse right down to the city's light rail.
Yeah, the reverberations of Iryna Zarutska's death, they really do highlight these deep cracks in multiple systems: justice, mental health care, even public safety on transit. And it's often at this point, isn't it, when communities are grappling with such awful tragedies that the conversation pivots sharply. It turns to one of the most, well, contentious issues in public discourse, immigration. But is that connection actually justified? Is that where the focus should be? Let's look at what the numbers really tell us, because public perception and the actual data, well, they seem to be miles apart on this.
And this brings us to a really crucial point the sources emphasize. This stark contrast between what people believe and what the empirical data shows about immigration and crime. You mentioned perception. Well, a January 2024 survey, for instance, found that a significant majority, 57% of Americans, actually believe that migrants lead to more crime. That's a really widespread belief. However, the reality, as shown consistently by, well, scholarly consensus and lots of empirical data, tells a very different story. Immigrants, and this includes even those without documented permission, are consistently found to be less likely to commit crimes or end up incarcerated than native-born citizens are. Now, just to give you some solid numbers on that, we can look at research from the Cato Institute. They used comprehensive data from Texas, and Texas is notably one of the only states that meticulously tracks this stuff by immigration status. And their findings, they're quite revealing. In Texas, back in 2019, illegal immigrants were 37.1% less likely to be convicted of a crime compared to native-born Americans. And what about legal immigrants? They're even less likely, 57.2% less likely to be convicted of a crime.
And this isn't just for, minor stuff. This trend holds across a whole range of crime types, including serious ones like homicide, sex crimes, larceny. To get really specific on homicide conviction rates again, 2019, Texas, for 100,000 people, native-born Americans had a rate of 3.1. Illegal immigrants, their rate was 2.2, and legal immigrants, just 1.3. And looking at arrests overall, the arrest rate for illegal immigrants was also significantly lower, 30.7% lower than for native-born Americans.
Wow, those numbers are really stark, aren't they? I mean, 57% of people believing one thing and the data showing almost the complete opposite. That's a huge gap between perception and reality. So what do our sources say really drives this persistent gap? Why do these beliefs stick around so strongly when the numbers seem to tell such a different story?
Yeah, it's a critical question how public perception gets shaped like that. And our sources dig into this quite a bit. They mainly attribute this widespread misperception to two things: anecdotal media stories that lack context, and what they call flashpoint events. These are individual, often very tragic incidents, right, like the one we're discussing. And these events are then, according to the sources, sometimes leveraged by politicians to promote what the sources identify as the myth of high immigrant criminality. You can probably think of some specific examples the sources cite: the tragic murders of Kate Steinle back in 2015 and Molly Tibbetts in 2018. These were deeply upsetting killings, and they absolutely galvanized public support for harsher immigration enforcement. And crucially, they provided anecdotal evidence, as the sources put it, for then President Trump's claims that illegal immigrants were responsible for a large number of crimes. In fact, Donald Trump is identified in the sources as the most prominent promoter of this narrative. He often featured angel families, that's families of victims killed by illegal immigrants, in his campaigns. And he directly asserted that crimes committed by illegal immigrants necessitated building a U.S.-Mexico border wall. Our sources, though, they make it quite clear that these claims have been regularly shown to be inaccurate when you actually look at the comprehensive data. The media's role here is also seen as critical. Particularly, some conservative outlets are noted for frequently highlighting individual high-profile crime incidents like the Zarutska murder. And the intention, as described in the sources, seems to be to suggest these incidents represent broader trends or policy failures, and to spark that discourse over soft-on-crime policies, really shaping public opinion around specific, isolated events rather than overall data.
And it's not just traditional media shaping these narratives anymore, is it? We saw a pretty pertinent example from Elon Musk recently. He publicly weighed in, pinning a post on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. He compared the media coverage of George Floyd's murder in 2020 to the coverage of Iryna Zarutska's murder, and his caption was simply, "divide by zero ratio." Now, that wasn't just a casual remark. It was a really powerful rhetorical statement, wasn't it? Essentially implying this massive, maybe infinite difference in media attention and public outrage between two very different tragic events. And it immediately fueled a pretty significant debate online about race and perceived media bias in reporting these kinds of stories. So, okay, with this really complex mix of data, perception, powerful rhetoric, what does it all mean for actual policy decisions? How do we approach these issues looking for real solutions?
Right, given this whole intricate landscape, the sources point to a whole range of policy implications and proposed solutions that are being debated right now. One major area is resource allocation. How do we decide where to put our money and effort? The perceived rate of crime by illegal immigrants is described as an important public policy issue, and some argue it should influence the allocation of federal immigration enforcement resources, state and local law enforcement resources, and also policies around arresting, detaining, and removing illegal immigrants. Basically, this view suggests if there's a perceived problem, you throw enforcement resources at it. Then you have the really contentious issue of sanctuary policies. These are policies where some cities or states limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. For instance, they might not hold someone for IC without a judicial warrant, or they might bar local police from asking about immigration status during routine stops. Now, interestingly, our sources mention research suggesting these policies actually have no statistically meaningful impact on crime rates and might even reduce them slightly. But the debate just explodes whenever an individual who was previously released under such a policy gets accused of a new crime. The Tulare County shooting suspect, for example, reports said he was released under California's sanctuary law SB 54. That reignited fierce opposition. On the flip side, you have states like Texas taking the opposite approach. Texas Senate Bill 4 from 2017 specifically aimed to prevent cities from adopting sanctuary policies. It really highlights that deep ideological split. And adding another layer, studies generally suggest that implementing immigration enforcement programs themselves, like increased IC raids or local partnerships, don't actually reduce overall crime rates. Now, shifting the focus a bit, many commentators highlighted and the sources argue that the real priority should be somewhere else entirely. They contend the main focus ought to be on improving mental health care and the lives of the general population to reduce crime. So instead of framing crime mainly as an immigration issue or even a racial issue, this viewpoint suggests tackling underlying societal problems and providing better support systems would be much more effective for public safety overall. But then you also hear calls for much stricter measures from other voices. Former President Donald Trump, for instance, is noted for advocating for restoring the death penalty in Washington, D.C., amidst what were perceived as crime crackdowns. That suggests a direct link, at least in some minds, between rising crime fears and a need for harsher penalties as both deterrent and justice. And on a more maybe practical level, but still significant, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is actively looking at policies that would let prisons jam contraband cell phones, which is really an attempt to boost security inside prisons by cutting off illicit communication that can facilitate more crime or endanger staff and inmates.
Yeah, it's really clear from the sources there's this powerful push for all sorts of approaches, isn't there? Everything from rigorously targeting these systemic failures in justice and mental health to fundamentally reevaluating immigration policies. What strikes me is just the sheer diversity of the proposed solutions and how many of them seem to directly clash with each other. The core challenge, it really seems, is finding and then actually implementing solutions that are truly based on evidence rather than just driven by emotion or, political rhetoric.
Exactly. And if we try to connect this all back to the bigger picture, what really emerges is this profound challenge we all face, navigating a world just saturated with information and these incredibly powerful, often conflicting narratives. Our sources really highlight that while yes, public fear and political talk often point towards immigrants as a major cause of crime, the empirical data, the actual numbers, consistently direct us towards much more complex systemic issues, things like fundamental failures within our justice system and these critical, often tragic gaps in mental health support.
Yeah, this deep dive really shows us, I think, that being truly well-informed means we have to look beyond the easy headlines and the political sound bites. It means examining the numbers, really digging into the sources, and critically understanding the human stories behind them, like Iryna Zarutska's devastating story, to truly address public safety in a meaningful way. Understanding this really complex web of facts, perceptions, policy debates, it's absolutely essential, isn't it, for any thoughtful citizen just trying to make sense of the world around us. So, Thinking about this persistent gap we've discussed between public perception and the empirical reality around crime and immigration, what single immediate action do you think would most effectively improve public safety in our communities right now? And maybe just as importantly, how would you even begin to verify its actual impact? Something to think about.